Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for coming to our event celebrating the new book, Global Media Giants. This is kind of an unusual hybrid event in that it will be a scholarly academic discussion followed by a book publication party celebration for this book. Afterwards, please join us in the Lynn Reading Room for reception in honor of our three editors. Global Media Giants is a new book co-edited by our three panelists here today. First, I'm Alan Deutschman. I'm a professor of journalism and the Reynolds Chair in Business Journalism here at the Reynolds School, and this program has been supported by the Endowment for Business Journalism we have from the Reynolds Foundation. We are so pleased today to have the three co-editors and co-authors of Global Media Giants. Next to me, beginning with our own Ben Birkinbine, Assistant Professor of Media Studies. In the middle, we have Janet Wasco, who is a professor and the Knight Chair of Communication Research at the University of Oregon in Eugene. And at the end, we had Rodrigo Gomez, who is an associate professor at Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City. I hope my Spanish pronunciation was passable here. They are the co-editors of Global Media Giants, and their work in this book involved coordinating the work of more than 24 other scholarly contributors. Just before the panel, we were trying to determine exactly. It's so many scholars contributed to this book that it was hard to count it. 37 scholars around the world writing about the media companies that have such a tremendous impact on economics, politics, and culture around the world. The book looks at these companies and puts them into different categories. Some are truly global giants, such as the Walt Disney Company, which that chapter was written by Janet. Others are what the editors have called geolinguistical companies that have tremendous influence over a part of the world that speaks a common language. Rodrigo did the chapter about Televisa, the extremely influential Spanish language company in Mexico and Latin America. And some of the companies are, of course, internet companies that have their pervasive worldwide reach. Ben did the chapter on Microsoft as well. I'd like to start out by asking our co-editors what motivated this book. Why Global Media Giants? Why not local media midgets? What motivated you with the topic, and in particular your approach, the specific approach you took to executing this book?
Yeah, I'll begin. Thanks for the question, first of all, and thanks, Alan, for organizing the panel. Thanks to the Chair in Business Journalism for doing all this. The short answer is that this idea began over Thai food during a lunch in Eugene, Oregon, when Rodrigo was visiting the University of Oregon as a Fulbright scholar, and I was finishing my PhD, and Janet is my advisor for my dissertation. But we started talking about the fact that all of us work within a field of communications research known as the political economy of communication. And what that does is it looks at how various companies basically exercise power over the production, distribution, and consumption or exhibition of communication resources, recognizing that they have a tremendous influence in the flows of information that are presented to audiences around the world, and how those texts are then interpreted within various particular cultural contexts. And we had talked about this, noting that there were some books that had looked at specific media companies throughout history. There are others, such as Benjamin Compain's collection, as well as Ben Bagdikian's collection, called The Media Monopoly, right? New Media Monopoly. But there wasn't a concise volume that looked at individual companies and the way they exercise power within particular domains. So that's how we developed the idea to ask those scholars that had been actively doing work on these companies, as well as those that lived within the particular jurisdiction that these companies operate, to write a chapter that speaks to this in a sort of concise way. So we imposed a relatively rigid chapter structure on our authors to say, listen, we want you to discuss economic influence, political influence, and cultural influence, and we want you to do so within about 8,000 words or so. I think my mic just cut out, but continue rolling on. All right? Yeah, anyway, so that's, I think, how the book came together, and we were commenting earlier, just remembering it's kind of miraculous that it actually all came together as well and as quickly as it did. I don't know, do you care to add anything else to?
I want to add that it was because of this guy. To a great extent, Ben was our lead editor, and we all shared the conception and the framework and read everything and wrote stuff and so forth. But Ben was our lead editor and did a fine job. It came together more quickly than we thought it would, because I don't know, some of you may be familiar with academic research and publications, and sometimes it can take a long time. Sometimes books never appear, actually. They're good ideas, but they never appear. So I was really kind of amazed that it came together so quickly. I think part of it was the choice of people we asked to be in the book. They were pretty well versed in the companies that we asked them to write about, and we told them, as Ben said, exactly how we wanted the chapters organized. Some of them resisted, but we insisted. And so the way it came together, I think, was kind of indicative of the importance of these issues. The way that we saw the book was not just to talk about media industries and concentration and so forth, and not just to look at one company and its power, but to look across all of these companies and examine the issue of power, media power, and so forth. And I think if we can get to just maybe one of the observations that I think is relatively important is a lot of times you'll read that media companies have so much power, and they do this and they do that and they do this. The big companies do a lot of things similarly. I mean, they have the same motivations often, which is, to make a lot of money for their stockholders and so forth. But the way they do that sometimes is different. And so to look, sometimes you can't generalize across these companies. You can say there's some general tendencies, but there are different ways that they decide to actually organize their companies and different strategies and so forth. And they also have different levels of, different organizations, different ways that they structure their companies. So for that reason, we thought it was really important to look at individual companies, but then also look at them together, and very importantly, across different countries, across the world. So I don't know what Rodrigo has to say, but
I will add something, because you already said almost everything in a brief way. But the only thing that I could like to add is that we thought that we need some work like this to comparative studies. The thing is that you can have a good overview of what is happening around the world, and at the same time you have the same variables to read every company. So I think that could be a very good output for students, graduate students and colleagues, to figure out in a big picture how the global media giants works. And at the same time, we have to say that when we were thinking in the name, we were thinking in other possibilities, for example, global communication giants, but we make sense that it was the right one to everyone to know what was the main issue to cover it.
Ben, you wrote about Microsoft, internet technology company. Do companies like, in the wake of the election, there's been a lot of scrutiny of the role played by companies such as Facebook and Google as media companies, and how people like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook are still resistant to this idea that they're media companies. How did you, in this book, and your co-authors, how did you approach the idea of technology companies as media companies, and what kind of political influence do they have as such?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the limitations that we sort of tried to address when we were putting the book together. Originally, our main intent was to cover only those companies that produced content specifically around the world. And after some feedback, discussion among ourselves, as well as feedback from some reviewers, they just said, listen, if you're going to talk about media giants, it's very difficult to ignore the tremendous influence of companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So, what's that?
Apple.
Yes, Apple as well is in there. So the question to include them was one almost of necessity, because they do play such a large role in facilitating the exchange of content, even if they are not producing themselves original content for consumption. The second part of the question was more kind of about how do particular companies grapple with that in being purveyors of content to various communities. Yeah, I've also been watching with amazement, actually, at some of the internal divisions that seem to be going on within Facebook as well as Google. I mean, Google and both Facebook now have made the decision to remove so-called fake news sites from their ad network. Google seemed to have done that out of a particular stance that they had taken. Facebook, on the other hand, I'm reading a lot of different reports that this is sort of an internal division within the company, that there are those within the company who feel as though they should not be discriminating on content, no matter what the content is. So they would espouse the so-called cyber libertarian ideology here, that basically all content ought to be treated equal, and we should be able to have the privilege to say whatever it is that we want to say, or people online should have the privilege to say whatever it is they want to say. And on the other hand, I believe they've now removed these fake news sites, despite the fact that they apparently only account for something like 2%, although I would point out that that's also based on Facebook's own reporting, and they refuse to open up their exact algorithm or measurements for how that was calculated. So a lot of it is sort of outside of the face of public scrutiny, which is another sort of issue that we'd come up against, particularly in with those companies that exist in countries that don't necessarily have either disclosure laws, transparency laws, or something like that. Anybody else want to comment on news? Yeah, I would leave it there.
Since I've started us on politics, I wanted to ask Rodrigo, writing about Televisa. We've seen in its tremendous political influence and kind of intimate connection to government. Can you tell us a little bit about media in Latin America and what's different about its political role?
Yes, sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's very important for the region and for the Mexican case. Other thing that we have to have in mind is that these kind of companies, in the case of Latin America, are related with the political system. You can understand the Latin American system with these companies because they grew up with them. And we are in transition to the democracy because I think that we are not mature democracies. So they have a lot of influence, or they have alliances with the political power. And at the same time, it's an explanation how those big companies grow. They were favored for those governments at the second part of the 20th century. So that's why they are global too, or some kind of global companies, because they were favored for those governments. In the case of South America, with military governments. In the case of Mexico, with this unique party of old pre the revolution, our institutional party. So we think in Latin America that if we open those communication systems in terms of more players and another kind of media like public service and the third sector of the media, community or citizen media, we could aspire to have a better democracy. So at the same time, of course, to have more competition in the private sector. And it's happening now. But of course, that it has to be related to with a media reform to have those possibilities to enrich our communication system. So we are trying to do that. And of course, Televisa is having an important role now in political terms, but not as in the old times. They have to change now and try to play with the rules of democracy and to try to be more discreet. In sometimes they are trying to do real journalism, for example. No, they are trying to do research or journalism, and now they are trying to say that they are not with any government, they are independent. But it is changing little by little. And we could say the same, for example, in the case of Brazil with Globo. In fact, you know that the government changed in they said a queue, like an institutional queue, COP, no? Q. Sorry for my pronunciation of the French, because it's a French word. So Globo supported that queue. So it was very influential in that political change. So yes, that's another reason. That's why we have to look how these companies develop their relation with the political system, with the cultural system, and how they have that economic power. The history helps us to figure out that trajectories.
Janet, you wrote the chapter about the Walt Disney Company, which has tremendous global reach and influence, particularly in the cultural sphere. I experienced this firsthand when I spent this past summer teaching American students in Italy for USAC, and I thought that going to a remote Italian hill town would somehow prime my 4-year-old daughter away from her obsession with Disney princess characters. And of course, the Disney characters were everywhere in our town, in Italy, in Europe. There's really no escape from Disney as you travel. What is that kind of cultural influence? Disney at one point was kind of a very American brand. How as a media company does it get into the culture of all these places around the world?
Yes, it is around the world. It's everywhere. In looking at Disney, and I'll first of all do a disclaimer. Once upon a time, I worked for Disney. Did you know that, Al? Yes, I very, very briefly, it kind of prompted me to go back to academe, and I didn't have a key job doing anything. But as I was thinking about media and also the influence of media and so forth, there were some studies of Disney around, but not that many at a certain point in time, and I thought, that'd be an interesting class to teach, because at the time Disney wasn't quite as big as it is today, but it was still ongoing and didn't seem to be going away and extremely popular. And so it did become a pretty interesting and popular class, and then led to more research that I've done on it since. And one of the pieces of research was a study of people around the world, audiences, consumers around the world, and what they think about Disney. So I think that was the best way to answer the question you asked. And it varies these days. We did this, well, about 10 years ago, but I don't think it'd be too different today. In some places, Disney is very much still seen as an American company. And it is identified with the U.S. And, there's reasons for that. A lot of times the films and other products come with all of the signs of, being American. But then at other times, the company adapts to the particular culture. And it was interesting to find that in some countries, people really have adopted or see Disney as not just American. Some people argued it's universal. It goes across borders and it's just universal. With an interesting title of one of the chapters in this study we did of Disney audiences around the world was Disney, It's So Danish. And incredibly, in the Scandinavian countries, the comic books, Disney comic books, are incredibly popular. In Denmark, I think the Donald magazine, Anders On, is the largest selling weekly magazine in the country. And so it's not just kids, it's adults. And of course, as you might suspect, if you think about it, Disney isn't just for adults, and that's very deliberate. So it can't just be associated with kids. And increasingly, look at what they've done lately and continue to do. What are the latest Disney films that you know of? And not the little fish. Doctor Strange, and the one that's coming out, Rogue One, the Star Wars. They're for kids, but they're also for us, right? So Disney theme parks also appeal across, families. They appeal to families. They appeal to adults. So there's that kind of, I don't want to say it's a universal kind of attraction or universal characteristic of Disney, because it's very deliberate. They are all over the world. But how they're perceived is kind of interesting. I think it varies to some extent. It also depends on the political situation of the time. I think in some Latin American countries, when we were doing this survey a while back, they really saw Disney as representing the U.S. in a very negative way. So anyway, it's an interesting question, which is certainly the Disney company is very interested in how they're perceived, and have adopted different kinds of strategies to get into countries all over the world and sell their products. So I don't know if I really answered your question, because it's a hard question.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
So are there confrontations sometimes between these truly global companies like Disney with these more kind of regional or language-based companies that are very powerful in particular parts of the world? Are there cases where these pan-global companies and these kind of regional single language companies clash over markets, over influence, and kind of what happens then?
Can I try that or start out? Because it reminds me of the argument that sometimes is made by people who study film and look at the marketing of films around the world and argue that Hollywood is dead and it doesn't have any influence anymore. And still, around the world, in markets for film, seen in theaters, on television, and whatever other screens have been added, U.S. companies still come in very well. In fact, Hollywood companies still dominate box offices around the world. Disney's revenues this year are going to be sky high. I mean, the year isn't over, and they're at $7 billion, and that's just amazing. So they compete with the national companies, but for years they've developed this kind of market power, even in other countries, where they are able to really dominate often, or at least compete very, very well with the national companies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in places where they don't, sometimes that's because of regulations and laws and attempts to prevent that kind of domination. But they're still pretty powerful in terms of capturing those markets.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, only to add something, the other thing that is interesting of the book to follow these big companies is that they have some particularities in terms that their most important brand, in the case of Disney, could be the movies. But they have a broadcasting, they have the leader in sports, and so on and so on. But we could say that the main asset that they have are the movies. And in the case of Comcast is the cable, but they have broadcasting and so on and so on. So the idea of the book is how do they deal with those different markets and activities at the same time and assets, and how do they make value in different ways around content and telecommunications and other things related with communication information. So how those companies are growing and growing and growing, and they make a lot of value with those many assets. So the idea is to try to figure out how do they play with so many branches that they have. No, in the case of the other giant in Mexico is Telmex, América Móvil, that is owned by Slim, Carlos Slim, that used to be the richest man in the world. And now he's going for the content. He has the nets, the telecommunications in Latin America. He is the leader, and now he's looking for content. No, and as you know, he has a big stake of the New York Times too. So, how they are dealing with those different branches and assets in the media?
What have you seen when American-based companies or companies that were started and grew out of the American culture, which is probably a minority of the companies you write about, and this definitely doesn't dominate. But when you have companies that are American companies based here, and they are operating around the world as media companies, what is typically their approach when they confront nations and cultures that don't have our conception of free speech, free press, political liberties, protections for journalists and media, even kind of diversity of population?
Anyone care that you want to know?
Well, one of the chapters that we have that tries to deal with those problems is the Middle East chapter, and that gave me the cue to talk about the chapters that are regionals. And the idea to go to the regional chapters is to try to understand how the global media giants operate in those markets or regions. And the idea was, because we don't know what is going on in those places, try to figure out what happened there, and at the same time to try to see if they have a local giants, a local regional giants or national players. But really, I only have to say that the Africa and Middle East chapter could deal with those questions and how the different companies try to set their different experiences to make business in those places.
Yeah, I guess I would follow up and just say that we also see a couple different interesting strategies for how American companies will try to get their programs into other national contexts. And one of them, at least from the television industry, is the development of formats, right? So you develop a format, a sort of generic formula for a show, and then it can be applied to local contexts. Some of those that jump out, although this isn't an American example, would be like the Idol series or The Voice, right? Or you even have like The View, right? The sort of all-female talk show. There are different national versions of that show around the world, right? But it could be developed by a company like Sony, for example, would develop a particular format and then try to sell that format to other regional or national companies for development and production within that national context. So it's not necessarily that there's a sort of direct kind of propagandizing on behalf of an American company, but they say, we've developed this sort of formula that we think works. And why don't we can just sell it to you and you can pay us the licensing fees, but then you can hire whoever it is that you want to hire to star on the show. The conversations on The View, on the Arab View, for example, can be much different than they would be on the American View. Could be very different from you have other versions of this show around the world. And I guess the whole idea about exporting American content, I would also say one of the things that was very beneficial about the book is to see how the authors approached this question historically. Because, I mean, it's incredibly important to consider the context here, especially after World War II. When the Cold War, so we ushered in the era of the Cold War, and it was then that the infrastructures of a lot of Western Europe, particularly Japanese companies as well, were just wrecked. I mean, literally there were bombs dropped on Japan. The countryside of World War II was basically decimated. So, but the U.S.'s infrastructure was still largely intact, and that led to a lot of the very easy export of American content to fill those market needs or something within those contexts. This also goes a little bit to some of Janet's work on Disney, for example, because Disney adopted a policy called, or maybe it was the administration, but the Good Neighbor policy, right? Where Disney would develop different characters within Brazil, within Latin Mexico, for example, and those characters then would have sort of characteristics of the particular local culture. So there was this very somewhat famous, or some would say infamous, example of an animated film called Los Tres Caballeros, right? So you have Donald Duck traveling around the world, and he would travel to Cusco in Peru, right? He would travel and then he traveled to Brazil as well, where he met his cousin Zé Carioca. And Zé Carioca is the Brazilian Donald Duck, for example. But the whole idea behind this was to develop some sort of appreciation for the American way of life, so that the Latin American countries would not choose to go socialist or communist. They wanted them to say, no, look at all of the great sort of fun that Donald is having in the U.S. You can have it too, just don't go socialist or something like that, right? And so maybe you guys can talk a little bit more about those examples or something, but I think it's an interesting way to consider the history of the companies and how they came up in their cooperation with the state.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the history of this, and it's and we did require all of the authors to do kind of this historical backdrop for talking about the corporations, because we think that's essential. And it's kind of interesting to see how some of the U.S. companies did become so powerful. Well, one thing is the U.S. generally, anyway, being a powerful country. But the point that Ben brings up about these historical instances, there were 2 world wars that decimated many countries, but not the U.S. There has also been, in terms of U.S., and a lot of times I'm thinking of film at this point, because that's often a focus of my research, but the Hollywood companies were able to provide those films to countries where they couldn't make films. But also they had very powerful allies historically to get products into other countries. The U.S. government supported Hollywood companies and still supports our companies, media distribution companies and so forth, in various ways. There are lobbying and powerful industry trade associations that help clear the way for American products. And this kind of historical backdrop really kind of explains some of how they've been able to maintain this power. Once they also were able to distribute their products globally and become pretty good at it and able to set up an international distribution system, even producers in other countries would use the U.S. distribution system to get their films and products to other countries. In addition, the U.S. companies were able to, because of the high volume of products they produce, were able to offer those products at a lower price. So if you're a company in Denmark and you make one film, you have to get a certain amount of money for it, but U.S. companies can come in, Disney can come in and offer it at a very, very low price because they're all over the world. They've got tons of products and so forth. So it's kind of that dumping, what is it called? Yeah.
Dumping.
Yeah, dumping products, at a lower price, and they just can't compete. There are other reasons, but this historical, I used to call it also the home market advantage or the home field advantage or home court advantage, depending on what sport you like. The U.S. is a huge market. So another reason why U.S. companies can offer their products cheaper in other countries is they've probably made enough money to pay for the production, the costs of the product, before they even go into other markets, the home court advantage. So all of those things together, historical reasons, economic, political, and then the cultural, I would say that's less important. I don't think people are naturally, they don't naturally like or prefer U.S. films. They do kind of, we like a lot of action and a lot of special effects and, slick production sometimes, and U.S. companies are able to do that. Compare that to a smaller country, a smaller company, not able to put all that money into special effects and all that. So it's those big films that U.S. companies are able to make that then also perpetuate their popularity and so forth. And again, I'm talking about film here. I think one of your question was also talking about journalism and other kinds of media.
Yeah, well, I've seen that in the foreign editions of the books I've written, which have been published by some of the companies in your book. Bertelsmann, when they owned Random House, News Corp is the owner of Harper. American book publishers in New York, commercial book publishers, will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce the English language American version of a book, and what they pay authors and editors and designers and publicists and such, and then they'll license the rights in Spanish or Chinese or Japanese or German for just a few $1,000s, maybe like 1 or 2% of what it costs to produce. But it's all just, it's gravy. It's all just, you can make a little bit of money from all these countries around the world, and it's all just kind of extra profit with no extra cost. And so if you're a publisher in these smaller markets, even European countries or the large, you're getting these books that you couldn't possibly afford to commission and produce on your own of that quality. And it's exactly one of the reasons that the American books are so dominant when you travel even to major countries in Europe or the Far East or Latin America.
No, in fact, that the other idea of the book was to show different industries. For example, how the publish industry is working around the world and how the big players are dealing with that market. For example, Bertelsmann, that is one of his major branches, is the editorial business. But let me back to your other questions related with information and freedom of expression, because I remember now that in the Middle East chapter, Al Jazeera is a very good example of that, because, for example, the Al Jazeera owners, they want to be a global news telecast, and they decide to open some office in London because they could be more freely in terms to do the journalistic work in that country than in Qatar. For example, women talking in the and working in the TV shows and so on and so on. So in some way you could answer, or I can answer your question, that how some countries are dealing with their local rules and dumping in some ways those rules to open their offices in other countries to try to be a global channel or a global brand, no? As Al Jazeera in the case of that company that wants to be a global one.
So Ben, on that note, if you're one of these giant Silicon Valley companies and you're confronted with doing business in China or in Russia, where you're dealing with countries that are really trying to control the internet within their countries, that are censoring searches on outlawed opposition groups. Putin in Russia recently said that internet companies need to store their data on Russian soil where he can access it. So if you're Microsoft, or for that matter, Google or Facebook or Apple, with extreme wealth and power, and yet you want to be in these big markets, are they taking those deals? Are they making the compromises? Are they resisting it? Is it some combination?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think about a couple different things. On the one level, you talk about content. Excuse me. Content. So the types of content that is either allowed or not allowed within a particular country. And I would just say, from personal experience and knowing colleagues that are actively working on trying to get dissident messages into oppressive regimes, I would never underestimate the power of people to find an alternative route to distribution. So for example, historical example was the development of satellite technology. There were people, for instance, living in Ethiopia that would leave Ethiopia, try to found their own satellite television station to try and start beaming messages back into Ethiopia. And if you've been following what's been going on in Ethiopia lately, it's the exact same thing. Ethiopia has now shut down the internet because of massive ethnic protests around the country. But there are different activists trying to find different ways to beam messages in, and that's very difficult when the internet is shut down, right? So I just spoke with a friend, Teddy, who actually Tewodros Workna wrote a chapter for the book as well on Africa. And he was telling me that he couldn't speak with his family, right? Because the way that they would communicate was via, WhatsApp or Skype or something. He was only able to talk to his sister, who worked for the Ethiopian Airlines, so that when she was in a different spot, he could actually communicate with her and find out what was going on. There are other people also, another colleague at the University of Oregon working on sort of digital activism within the specific Ethiopian contexts. But there we're not talking about the matter of a preference. I mean, we're literally talking about life and death. I mean, these people have had their lives threatened for trying to undermine the Ethiopian regime, for example. So that's on the content sort of activist side of trying to get messages out. People are very determined, right, to get those messages out. On the company side, when it comes to content, we have seen certain companies make concessions on content. They say, yes, we want access to the Chinese market as in terms of content, so we will, abide by the Great Firewall, for example. But at the same time, those companies rely on, for example, the cheap labor to produce the devices that can enable the transmission of those messages. A great chapter on Apple in the book by Rick Maxwell and Toby Miller, and they really look at, excuse me, I am having I might need another drink. They do a really good job at tracing the commodity chain of Apple, right? Looking at who produces those, not only who produces the iPhone that we all, or many of us, are holding. In fact, some pictures are being taken right now with an iPhone. But also looking at where the minerals come from to produce the iPhone. And we find out that this is a tremendously networked, all the way back to, particular minerals that can only be found specific spots around the world. So it's extracted, say, from Angola, for example. Those materials then are transported to somewhere else to actually sort of fabricate the particular gears and everything else. Later then they're transferred to China, where they're then assembled, and then basically from China then they would be distributed to local markets around the world. So it is an interesting question, but it depends on what we're talking about, because they have no problem either willfully ignoring regulations, human rights issues or anything like that to construct the things, and yet then again they're willing to sacrifice those principles in order to gain access to deliver content, for example. So it's kind of complicated. On the other hand, I would say, particularly with the Chinese giants as well, I mean, if you want to look for some of the fastest growing companies in the world, look no further than the Chinese market. There's a company called Tencent, which has, I believe, the largest growth of any company in the world for the past 5 years. This is a massive company, and it's covered in the book. They offer everything from instant messenger services, something called WeChat, which I believe is one of the largest, if not the largest, chat application that's out there. Right? What's that?
Must be.
I think it is, absolutely. They're also doing things like sort of internet portal things, social networking as well. I mean, that is the company that basically sort of rules right now and is really an emerging power on the global scene.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one more dauntingly big, confoundingly complex question, and then kind of turn the questions over to you in the audience. So please think of your own dauntingly complex questions. So recently there was an announcement of the proposed merger of AT&T and Time Warner. I for 7 years worked for Time Warner. Since we're doing
Full disclosure,
and if they don't raid the Time Warner pension, I will get some money from them when I retire. Not much. We were confronted with news of these giant global media companies trying to get even bigger through these blockbuster mergers. How should we think of these proposed mergers? Is it something that these companies truly need to be competitive on the global stage, or is it efforts at oligopoly, monopoly, reducing competition, enriching the deal makers and executives?
We're going to fight over it.
Yes.
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 That's the answer, yes. Yes. What's interesting about that is, there's all kinds of interesting things about it, but do they need to be bigger? Mm-hmm. That's often used as, it's an amazing argument. It was used when Time came together with Warner. They have to be big in order to compete in global markets. And it was an amazing, the first annual report they did was an amazing document that argued that point. And at any rate, so they will argue that, but some of these companies make an enormous amount of profit, and they are expected to keep growing. So there's a very good book, I think, that hits this hard recently. I don't know if you're familiar with Douglas Rushkoff, who gets around, kind of a public intellectual type. He's now at Queens College in New York. And his latest book is Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. And his argument, one of his arguments, is that digital technologies, first of all, was supposed to really provide this amazing possibilities of everything, people sharing in the wealth and egalitarianism and all kinds of wonderful things. Well, he's somewhat disappointed, and he helped create some of these technologies because he worked in Silicon Valley. But he's saying, why hasn't this been the case? There is more wealth, but a lot of it's not working for everyone. In fact, people are losing jobs and blah blah blah. And he highlights growth and the growth of corporations because they have to keep growing stockholders, investment folks, venture capitalists, they all want them to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And some of the companies, I think he uses the example of Twitter, that does fairly well but doesn't grow enough, hasn't grown enough, right? So it's not doing very well. But the growth, and what that means is growing not just in terms of profits, but in the ways that the resources of the world are being used and how they're being used and so forth. Throw in some environmental issues here too, this whole notion of growth. And I think it's a key. And I think he does a fairly good job of identifying this as one of the key problems. There's certainly other problems as well, but which Rodrigo will address.
I will talk about another problem. For example, the thing with AT&T and Time Warner is that AT&T has the pipes for the internet, and as we know, all the contents are going to that way to distribution. So the thing is that they will prefer, or they will rather give preference to their content, to Time Warner content, to HBO content, etc. So there is a lot of issues related with those things. For example, if the net neutrality doesn't apply, they could close the pipes for Netflix, for example, and you can have a good Netflix vision or whatever, no? So there is a lot of issues related with these kind of things, not just in terms of the big thing in terms of money, but in terms of how do they are getting bigger in this kind of different cross-ownership business.
When I started as a reporter at Fortune magazine, which was part of the Time Incorporated magazine company, which was Fortune and Time and Life and Sports Illustrated. And in the late 80s, they merged with Warner, which was one of the big Hollywood studios. And it was like, oh, we have to be bigger. We have to be in all the different media and entertainment. And it was Time Warner. And then they merged with AOL because we had to be in technology. And that was one of the most disastrous deals ever. And then they got rid of AOL. And then they got rid of Time Inc. And so they kind of bulked up and they've stripped down. And now they're trying to get together. And it seems that depending on where you are in these cycles, they say we need to be bigger. No, we need to have this clearer. It's got to be very confusing to people trying to make sense of the news of all these deals.
And I would also just add very quickly that AT&T holds a very specific place within the consciousness of American business history, after all, because remember, AT&T was granted a government-sponsored monopoly for how many years? I mean, it was at least, it was at least 60 years or something like that, right? Before they finally broke them out, broke the Bell system off, and now it's back. So like LL Cool J says, don't call it a comeback. They've been here for years.
I think that's a great note too. Unless Janet, do you want to?
One of the things I just want to throw this out, just thinking of the difference between Disney and Time Warner and AOL, and why it didn't work, AOL, Time Warner. And at the time, everyone was saying you got to do synergy. All these different diversified activities need to work together. And one of the complaints of Time Warner and AOL is that they didn't do that. Now, I don't know, they might have made other mistakes as well, but one of the things that Disney has done very, 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 very well is that notion of synergy. They have diversified activities and they promote them together, they cross-promote. Lion King is a movie, then a Broadway play, and lots of consumer items, and a theme park ride, and blah, 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 blah. So it's across the company. So they're
and when you're
good
a parent,
at that.
you have to own all of these things.
Yeah.
It's required.
And it's very deliberate. It's not accidental. So one of the things that was argued is that Time Warner didn't do a good job of that, and that's why that whole thing didn't work. But we'll see.
But it can work, and Disney and other companies show that those synergies between all these different forms of media and entertainment can work if done properly. Great. Do you have questions from the audience? We have this remarkably large and heavy microphone, which we can pass over to you for your questions. So.
I have a question about the Disney and trademark law. I may have my facts wrong because I'm not familiar with a lot of American corporate history, but from what I understand, the copyright law here is in part determined by Walt Disney wanting to keep its trademark of Mickey Mouse. And if this is the case, do you see an end point for Walt Disney dictating trademark law? And if, just general thoughts on that.
Would you hold that? Okay. Do I need the mic? Yeah. Oh, we need the mic back here.
Yeah, it's a great question. Disney has been very instrumental in fighting for the extension of copyright protection, specifically because copyright expires after a certain period of time. And Disney's argument was that releasing their characters to the public domain would be bad for not only their business, but that it would somehow stifle their own ability to innovate within their particular characters. So for example, if Mickey were to go to the public domain, Mickey could show up in anything. Any one of us could use Mickey in whatever sort of publication we wanted to. So Disney has been very instrumental in arguing for this. The second part of the question is, do you see any end in sight? The way that the courts have decided this are basically that the Constitution only stipulates that rights ought to be granted to authors and inventors for a limited time, limited times. And they said as long as 150 years is still a limit, that limit could continue theoretically, right? So yes, they lost that case and there's still a limit. Now that also implies that 1,000 years could still be a limit, right? But the argument, sort of the burden falls on those of us that don't want to see that continued to come up with some better argument. People that argued that course, that case before the Supreme Court argued that it was bad for culture. And in retrospect, they went back and they said, we shouldn't have made the cultural argument. We probably would have been better making an economic argument. That basically it's bad for the economy by not allowing for these characters to go out, to allow for all sorts of other innovations with things that are sort of unforeseen, and that in fact would be better for the economy. Now, the companies don't like that very much, but especially those that do that type of research to show that it actually makes sense, but that's what they would argue.
There's a basic contradiction, actually, with copyright, trademark, and so forth, because once you give copyright, it is a monopoly, right, over a particular character, blah, 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 whatever. So it's kind of a contradiction to the notion of competition. But it's argued that it stimulates competition. So the whole premise of copyright, in a sense, is against the notion that we have a competitive economy, which we don't. And then the other point here is that it's not just the Disney company itself being so influential. All of the major studios and the information industries, lots and lots of folks got together to lobby to extend copyright. And they will again when it comes close to the end of this period. And this is lobbying organizations, trade associations. There's a trade association called the Motion Picture Association of America. It's very much a lobbying organization and does most of the lobbying for the major television and film companies. And they're in there doing all the things that lobbyists do to get what the companies want. So, yeah, so Disney doesn't control it necessarily, but, they were very influential and benefited quite a bit. So,
another question? And Caesar behind you as well.
So you have companies that are legacy companies that have been around for a very long time, and then the new technology companies that are much newer. Do you see differences between those two groupings of companies in terms of vulnerability or policies? How are they more fragile? How are they different, do you think, between those two groups?
Yeah, like I was saying at the beginning, there are some tendencies that are general tendencies that are the same. They're not different. They're corporations. They're organized. They're incorporated for a specific reason. If they're public, they have to serve their shareholders and all of that. So there's similar kinds of things going on, but depending on what kind of business they're involved in, there may be different strategies. And I think sometimes one of the distinctions between the companies, these big, powerful, these big media companies and media giants that have been around a long time, they're not as flexible or as some of the newer companies. And I've been trying to figure this out. I think other people probably are better at it than I am, but I think one of the things is the flexibility of getting into new businesses and moving in all kinds of directions. Even though the bigger companies have been diversified, but the newer ones are even more flexible. Maybe someone else can come up with something better.
Mm-hmm. No, and the other thing is that they are new and they are in the wave of the innovation, and they are the leaders in those areas, and they are taking advantage of that lead, and they are dealing with information, not with content particularly, and pipes, no? Well, and software and hardware. No?
Yeah. You don't have to say anything.
Thank you. I'm interested in how journalism fares in this process. And I guess I'm thinking of huge companies that have journalism divisions that might be relatively small but still influential within a large company. Or even companies that have not necessarily journalism divisions, but tentacles that affect journalism. Can you talk a little bit about your observations or conclusions on either benefits or consequences of journalism being a part of the big puzzle?
Yeah, I'll just sort of speak very generally. I would say that generally speaking, some of the news or the journalism divisions of particularly large companies, for example, CBS, is a notoriously sort of I don't want how to say this, but they don't make a lot of money, right, for the company. So they're seen as sort of something that's necessary, and they do it kind of for the public good, but they also recognize that it doesn't make a lot of money for them. So that's more on the kind of corporate diversity standpoint. But I would say the other thing that's interesting about the question is the notion of transparency, or how we figure out what these companies are doing in the first place. So, and I would say there's a couple different things that are very important to note. And this gets back a little bit to the discussion we were having about particular regulations, about disclosures or free speech and that sort of thing. We noted, all of us, as we were doing our research, that we rely very heavily on corporate documents, right? And not just corporate documents, but documents produced by these companies for the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the 1933 Act mandates that any publicly traded company needs to file annual reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it needs to disclose their business operations, what they're doing, how the companies are structured, their boards of directors, and selected financial data, as well as any lawsuits that maybe this company may be involved in, and why. Now, in part, these documents are prepared for investors, right? It's supposed to be a document for investors to say, here's the health of the company, everything's great, here's where we are going forward. But in other places around the world, they don't have these documents to rely on. So I would say the importance of having these documents publicly available And I would also note that, by the way, the SEC chairwoman just stepped down 3 years ahead of the end of her term as well. So it's highly important to continue that level of transparency on these companies, however imperfect it may be. It at least gives us a glimpse into what the companies are doing, how they describe themselves, because you can really find out a lot about the companies that way when either doing research or trying to investigate what a particular company does.
Well, to try to answer your question in a general term, I would say that, for example, News Corp in our book is a clear example of negative effects in journalism. For example, in Britain, they have to close a newspaper because they have bad behavior in terms of journalism and ethics. And you can see a lot of examples in the case of News Corp. But at the same time, for example, in the case of Time Warner with CNN, for some countries, CNN in the cables systems are a good news reporter in our countries. For example, for Latin America, they hire some Mexican journalist that she was fired for a Mexican radio station, and she was very popular, or she is very popular. And the only company that gave her a room to have a news program, it was CNN. So you can see different behaviors of these different global giants. And of course, the thing that we could say is that we can't generalize with all these global giants. In some ways, they behave better. For example, you say CBS, well, 60 Minutes, I think, has a good trajectory in some way for this country, and so on. And we could go little or one by one, and we could see some positive behaviors and another one negative behavior. There is not a rule to measure this kind of global giants in terms of journalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still mic'd. It was interesting hearing Janet's discussion of the dynamic of these companies that have publicly owned stocks with the constant need for growth and increasing profits. And I think of so many of the great journalistic institutions and media enterprises in the U.S. which were family-owned or tightly family-controlled businesses that could, over the course of decades, not maximize profits, but make a good sustaining profit while being dedicated to values of public service, and how much harder that is when you get into these companies that have this constant imperative for growth. It's just a different dynamic.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you a Disney example, which I tend to do. Disney has been an entertainment company and not so much involved, in fact, not at all, I would say, in journalism, until they bought a company called ABC Capital Cities in the 90s, right? And not only did they get ABC, the network, and they wanted a network at that time, they got news with that, but they also got all those newspapers, right? Cap Cities newspapers. They didn't keep them that long. And maybe someone can explain this better than I can, but my suspicion is that was a business they didn't want to be in. They were unfamiliar with it, or it wasn't as profitable as they wanted, or whatever. But they also then, after they sold all the newspapers, there were examples of, at the time, their chief executive officer, Michael Eisner, apparently was very interested in influencing the kind of news that was reported. And so there were examples of, I don't know if it was just Eisner, but it was at that period, but there were examples that came out of squashing stories or trying to influence stories and so forth. So there's the potential for that. When you have these major, huge corporations, they have the potential to influence the reporting of news. But I think there's enough of a tradition, or there used to be at least, of reporting and journalism where that, egregious, terrible examples will come out because they've stepped back since. They'll promote their businesses, but I haven't seen as much of that direct kind of influence to influence the news reporting, if that makes sense. So.
What about News Corp?
Oh, well, that's totally different. And there are differences between corporations, again, as Rodrigo pointed out, but also differences between owners and managers and the way they operate. Some of them are more hands-on. Others are just sit back and collect the money.
Mm-hmm. We have
But
other.
all collect money.
All collect money.
We have other questions from the audience. Yes, I'll take it back.
Thanks. Just a question. Given everything you've discussed, the landscape of media consolidation and the sort of oligarchic control of the networks of distribution of the media landscape, that sort of thing, do you think that, I don't know, this is sort of a speculative question, do you think there are possible ways for companies that are not giants, right, to not necessarily thrive, but even survive as profitable, one, or potentially, if there's a way forward that I'm not thinking of, perhaps like a non-profit model or something. But basically, at this point, and Janet, I think you mentioned that this isn't really an environment of competition anyway, but, is it possible, given the state that we're in, for there to be anything resembling independent media?
There has been very strong, a strong legacy of public media in other countries, at least. And Professor Stavitsky here can tell you about this country and public broadcasting. We still have it, but it tries to survive. There are other models, but it looks, and also the digital technologies, the internet, and all of that should have helped all that, right? But we still have that same model of, gosh, should I say the C word? Ugh. Of capitalist industries, that growth and profit and so forth. Actually, Doug Rushkoff in the book that I mentioned has lots of ideas about how it can be improved. Along the lines of what you're saying, companies that sustain themselves and just, they make a modest profit. What kind of companies we support. He has all kinds of ideas. I don't know if I would agree that that's going to solve the whole problem, but at least he says we're dealing with a difficult situation and we have to make the best of it. And he has some really interesting ideas about how smaller companies, supporting smaller companies and so forth, could indeed help. So.
Yes, and in the case of Latin America, the media reform is trying to get room to the third sector of the media, to the citizen media. So that's the idea, to try to make room and to give some funds to survive, because otherwise it is not going to be sustainable. But yes, I think that we have to reorganize our communication systems to have the three different players of the communication system. That's the private, the public one, and the citizen one. Yeah.
Just to add, we have media reform too. A little bit. There are organizations out there, and I don't know about all of you, but I've been hearing a lot from them during the campaign and after the election, and they're not going away. And maybe there's going to be much more support of them, I hope. So that there are people arguing that there are other ways of doing it. So let's hope.
I'll just add something really, really kind of generally to the question, but I would just say that it depends on what the purpose is. If you're talking about corporate sustainability, that's one thing, right? That's a commercial model of media that necessitates some sort of sales, advertising, whatever it might be. There's also the public model, but then we also do have a very long history, and people shouldn't forget this, of citizens media or community media, radical media, that goes back hundreds of years, actually. And the goal of those organizations may not necessarily be to earn a profit to try and sustain themselves, but to address a very specific issue at a particular time and then move, right? Sort of ephemeral media, right? Even if it's just starting either like little flyering campaigns, little zines, like the whole zine scene that I'm still happy to see is still around. There are places around Reno you can still find zines, which is great. So all of that is very good. I mean, feminist magazines, radical magazines, anarchist magazines, all of these things are still out there, but their goal isn't necessarily to, continue on and earn a profit or something like that, but it's to have a voice be heard. So look out for that. Go support your local zinesters, wherever you are.
See, we did get to local media pipsqueaks, which could be a whole other.
Well, one of our authors refers to the dwarfs, right? Yeah, we have a media dwarfs in Eastern Europe. It's interesting.
And trolls.
And trolls too. Yeah.
Do we have one final question for our panelists before we retire to the Lynn Room for refreshments and celebration?
Thank you. So earlier, Rodrigo, you mentioned Carmen Aristegui, the journalist who was cast out from her radio show. And this kind of brings up a question about the repression of against journalists and the censorship. And a lot of this censorship kind of, from what I understand, happens at the hand of the state. The state is the principal actor in censoring journalists. But I'm curious to know if maybe these, from your research, if these global media giants, if they play a role in censorship as well, for maybe alternative journalists or independent journalists.
You want to start?
Well, yes, in the case of Mexico, all the TV and broadcast companies, they accept that censorship from the government because this happened, it's not the first time that it happened. It happened with the other administration, and this journalist was hired again because the company and the owner was make a statement in front of the government and say, I am going to sustain this journalist because we are experiencing freedom of expression and we want this kind of journalists to inform our country. But now they didn't, or they didn't do it. So it's because they make some kind of auto-censorship? Like self-censorship. So in the case of Mexico, I think now all the companies are following the voice of the government. So there is some kind of self-censorship there too. So that's my example, for example.
Yeah, and to your point, yes, there are examples of that happening. I mean, a lot of times journalists will be repressed by the state, where there's plenty of historical examples as well as contemporary examples of this around the world. So it's absolutely an issue we should all be paying attention to, especially those of us in the journalism school. There are indices that rank how safe it is for journalists to operate within particular countries. There are indices that sort of look at the policies that are designed to protect journalists within particular national contexts. So all of that is very important. There's also the issue of self-censorship. So if you fear repression, to what degree do you actually not speak up or not speak up as powerfully as you should or something like that? Those are deeply personal, ethical decisions that people make on a daily basis. It's no small task to speak truth to power, right? And that's, at least according to classic liberal democratic theory, that's the function of the press. That's what we're supposed to do. So, the watchdog, right? So go bite somebody,
or at least bark.
Yeah.
Do you other comments?
No.
Good. Well, I'd like to thank our panel so much for being here. And thank all of you for being here and for your excellent questions. And you are invited to join us and to continue the conversation one-on-one with our editors over refreshments in the Lynn room on the first floor. Well, we're on the first floor, in the other corner of the first floor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.